Hi, and welcome to the briefing. My name is Josie Duffy. The briefing is a project between the Appeal and Now This. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, my name is Josie Duffy. I'm president of the Appeal. We're a nonprofit news network that provides original coverage of the criminal justice system. And I'm so excited to be joining our guest today. Today, we'll be talking about the possibility of $1 trillion in relief for state, local, and tribal governments in the upcoming pandemic relief package. Speaker Pelosi has pushed for the funding, but Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he'd rather see states and cities declare bankruptcy during the pandemic, which would include cutting or halting critical everyday services like schools, first responders funding, or garbage collection. Charlene Kenyon loved her job for Tacoma City government for 35 years, and she was close to retiring before layoffs forced her out, just shy of receiving her pension. She is one of what could be millions of impacted people and families across America. To talk about what it will take to get that funding through and how it could help people across the country, we are joined by Representative Deb Haaland from New Mexico's 1st District, who has been talking about the pandemic's impact on tribal communities and fighting for fundamental needs like broadband access for schools and telehealth in rural communities. We are also joined by Treasurer Tashara Jones of St. Louis, who has been working alongside state and local leaders to help hard-hit communities and has been pushing for direct aid from Congress to allow state and local budgets to meet the needs of the pandemic. Hartford Council member Wildelise Bermudez is with us to talk about vulnerable communities in her city, including residents at increased risk of deportation as a result of the pandemic. And we have Sarah Johnson, Executive Director of Local Progress, a national network of local city and state elected officials working to help families through improving state and local policies. But before we start, let's start with some context. So cities and states are facing a roughly $1 trillion budgetary shortfall, $1 trillion, over the next few years because of reduced revenue and increased expenses caused by this pandemic. According to recent reporting by the Washington Post, the National League of Cities, joined with the US Conference of Mayors, found that many local governments are bracing for sharp declines in tax revenue as businesses shutter, workers lose their jobs in record numbers, and tourism grinds to a halt. Without congressional help, cities and states will be forced to stop paying police, firefighters, teachers, garbage collectors, and other crucial employees. According to the same report by the Washington Post, nearly 9 in 10 cities surveyed by the National League of Cities signal that they expect a revenue shortfall. Among them, more than 1,100 cities are preparing to scale back public services. Mitch McConnell is suggesting the bankruptcies that cause these problems are better than congressional help, even though he is happy to bail out multi-billion-dollar corporations, including hedge funds, big healthcare, pharmaceutical companies, and real estate developers. So let's start with you, Representative Haaland. I'm just making sure I can see you. Okay, I can see you, great. You've been out front speaking about the kinds of support that local and tribal communities need right now. And you've talked about the importance of closing the digital divide in Native American communities. And you introduced the COVID-19 Disaster in Indian Country Act, which would grant tribes temporary emergency access to broadband networks on tribal lands. What are you hearing from people in your district and from tribal communities across the country about what's needed in terms of support for state and local governments in order to get through this pandemic?
Josie, thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be able to talk about these issues. So look, what's happened is with this pandemic is it's magnified the disparities in Indian country. In some communities, tribal communities, lack of running water or the water's polluted, no electricity, no access to fresh foods, and broadband internet service, the lack of it. Some Indian tribes have the darkest spots in their states. But look, all of those things have made this pandemic so much more challenging for Native communities. First, we're holding the Trump administration accountable for the blatant mismanagement of funding included for tribes. It was clear that they attempted to put corporations ahead of sovereign governments, and that delayed the funding. And that's wrong, absolutely. I am so pleased to see my governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, and tribes have been working together on running water and food access. So that's a load off of my mind. I'll be focusing my energy right now on broadband. It's crucial for telehealth, remote education, and tribal people being able to apply for unemployment benefits, unemployment, business loans, SNAP benefits, for example. I talked with someone in Jemez Pueblo, which is north of my district, not too long before we, were working remotely. And he mentioned to me that the internet line, the fiber that was running through their tribal land, was not more than 40 feet away from the community buildings that need it most. But they couldn't access it because they didn't have the license to access it. So my bill to give emergency access to spectrum licenses to tribes will be life-saving to them. They'll be able to connect their communities. And right now I'm feeling like internet service, that's a human right in a way. We all have to be connected during this terrible pandemic.
So you mentioned some of them. Talk to me about what are some of the obstacles in Congress to getting the needed state and local relief, and what effect that can have on people living in places with major budget shortfalls, particularly the places you're mentioning. I really liked what you said about focusing on corporations instead of sovereign governments, and I'd love to hear more about that.
So 2 weeks ago, Congress passed a bill to increase funding to assist small businesses, but we all know that the Republicans across the board stopped us from including provisions that put people first, like funding for local, state, and tribal governments. If we don't provide funding for state, local, and tribal governments, like you said, Josie, firefighters and police officers don't get paid. Doctors and nurses don't have the resources to keep people healthy. And small businesses, which are the backbone of my district and many people's districts, will absolutely suffer. So what we're saying is that state, local, and tribal governments, they need the flexibility. They need to be able to spend the money where it's needed most. And we need to make it easier for them to access the money. The city of Santa Fe, for example, that is our state capital right here in New Mexico. It didn't qualify for that funding because they didn't reach an arbitrary population threshold. And even cities who did meet that threshold said they couldn't use the funding to cover revenue shortfalls. So our local governments are doing everything they can, but they're stretched thin. And that's why I'm so glad to work on getting the resources to our state, local, and tribal governments in the next package, and hopefully make it easier for them to access these funds.
So let's talk about the next package. Can you tell us a little bit about what's in the bill, the version that kind of came out in just the past few hours? And will there be a $1 trillion relief program, $1 trillion relief package for city, state, and local governments, budget shortfalls in particular, in the next stimulus package?
Look, the $1 trillion, that's the number that Speaker Pelosi mentioned to us a few weeks ago. And I think it's on par with the support that our families, workers, and small businesses need. Overall, this is an historic bill. And I'm grateful that Speaker Pelosi and leadership, the chairs of all the committees, have taken my ideas and issues seriously. The bill represents hundreds of hours of conference calls, online meetings, text messages, between the chairs and all of us. So all of us have been working very hard to make sure that we're getting in the bill what we know our communities need. Right now, we're going through this 1,800-page bill, but I can say that it includes $500 billion for states, $375 billion for local governments, $20 billion for Indian tribes. Those are tribal governments. There's also a $3.6 billion funding for safe and secure elections. That can't be, the importance of safe and secure elections can't be overlooked. $5.5 billion for broadband, including hotspots and at-home connectivity. $2.1 billion for the Indian Health Service, which is absolutely needed because of it's been underfunded for decades and decades. And of course, funding to fight this virus in many ways.
So for more on this, I think we should bring in Treasurer Tashara Jones of St. Louis. Treasurer Jones, you recently suspended the collection of parking revenues in St. Louis to prioritize the health and safety of city employees and the economic well-being of community members. Can you talk a little bit about some other examples of the economic struggles that people in Missouri and St. Louis in particular are going through, and other ways that we can be relieving this pressure on both the community and local government?
Yes, great. Thank you for having me. I echo what Congresswoman Haaland said, that this disease just magnified the disparities in Black communities too, and it's no different in St. Louis than it is in any other urban city. Our communities are suffering, so they're struggling to pay their rent or their mortgage. So if there was a moratorium on paying rent or mortgage, that would help. We could do what Canada did and did universal basic income, $2,000 per family for the length of the pandemic, would definitely help people out, rather than the $1,200 minimum check that was sent out as a stimulus payment that a lot of people still haven't received. There's a food shortage. A lot of people are food insecure. And we see the lines are miles long when food pantries are starting to give away boxes of food. Our Urban League has stepped up to the plate and has been a tremendous community partner in giving out food and supplies. But every time they do, the lines are miles long. And then also, the Congresswoman talked about the digital divide. That's a real issue in Black communities as well. A lot of our school children, our public schools are 88.5% of our children qualify for free or reduced lunch. And a lot of them didn't have internet at home or devices to be able to continue their schoolwork. So we saw a huge divide there as well. So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. We don't know, the other problems. And when we talk about violence and domestic violence in the home, that goes into a whole nother category. But those are the things that I think that are on top of mind of what of the things that the disparities that we've been seeing since this started.
I think you two are both highlighting something that, has obviously been more and more clear as the pandemic goes on. The people who are already suffering in this country, poor people, people of color, people in rural communities, people in tribal communities, are the ones who are suffering even more in light of the virus. And it's not even just that they're more likely to get sick, which is also true, but they're more likely to suffer from sort of the societal effects of what we're seeing. So we're so grateful for the work that you all are doing. What kinds of services would St. Louis be forced to cut if Congress doesn't come through with more funding?
Well, we're already looking at our budget, and there's a $40 million hole with fiscal year 21. And some of the things that are already on the table are our violence prevention programs. We put $7 million in a violence prevention program because, as a lot of people know, St. Louis is one of the most violent cities in the country. And there was $7 million in that program, and they're looking at taking that money back. Street sweeping, building inspectors, infrastructure projects, also, paving our streets, repaving our streets. A lot of those will get delayed because they also took the aldermanic budget and slashed that as well. But there's a silver lining in one of the things that could be cut. We've been trying to, we meaning activists and myself, have been trying to close an outdated jail that we call the workhouse. That budget was slashed by half. And this pandemic could likely make them close the workhouse and combine all of the prisoners or our people that are in jail into one jail. So that's the silver lining there, but still we'll be slashing services, public safety, health services more than they already are, because as the Congresswoman said, our budgets are already stretched to the limits anyway.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to hear what you're saying, which is that they've already cut violence prevention. And while it looks like they might cut jail funding, it would be nice to see that happen first before cutting prevention instead of happening last, but I guess we'll take what we can get on that. So I want to turn to Councilmember Bermudez. Can we talk about what's happening in Hartford? So Hartford has recently proposed cutting critical services, including a $30,000 fund for residents who are facing deportation proceedings from the Trump administration. Can you talk about who was relying on that fund, what that fund did, and how these cuts are going to impact vulnerable communities in your district?
Yeah, so in Hartford, Connecticut, in Connecticut, a lot of our cities predominantly are Black and Brown cities, Black and Brown communities. And last year I introduced legislation and it's a fund called the Families Facing Deportation Fund, where we took funds from our health department, the City of Hartford Health Department, for normally placed towards relocation services. And because we have undocumented families who would otherwise not receive any kind of assistance, we allocated those funds to help them when the family members are going through deportation. And so with our undocumented community, and this is true whether you're looking at it at the local level or at the state level, very big need from these communities to have some kind of assistance. And with the lack of assistance, from the lack of response for any funds to be allocated at the federal level, we knew that we had to step up. Right now, during this pandemic, people are still they're unfortunately still facing deportations. And with having no funds available to them, and having, in many cases, going from a 2-parent household to then a 1-parent household, and on top of that, suffering all of the ramifications of what the pandemic has caused, job loss, economic loss, and so on and so forth. It's really a double whammy in terms of what families have to face. And so we, our city council, we were able to approve those funds, the Families Facing Deportation funds, last year. We are trying to approve them again, trying to push to approve them again at the local level, because if we don't do it at the local level, then what kind of assistance will be made available to them? And the answer is none. And so we really have to push the envelope on this, because if we don't advocate, then who will? And the need is there greater than before. So that's kind of what we've been working on.
Yeah, I mean, you described it as a double whammy. It's really like a quintuple whammy, right? And what we're seeing here is that the people who, should be helping and looking out for these communities aren't always focused on them, making not just bad situations just as bad, but even worse than they were before. Exactly. So what other cuts are likely to happen in the next few months?
So right now in our cities, in the city of Hartford, we've, in the last 10 years, just to put things into perspective, our city budget, half of it goes towards education. So our public school system. And then the other half goes for all the regular stuff that we need, road maintenance, police department, fire, et cetera. And so for the last 10 years, our public schools have been flat funded. So there have been no newer funds available to our Hartford public school system. And so you can only imagine what's going to happen now. And earlier, others were mentioning the ramifications of the pandemic and how it's felt by our communities and our most vulnerable populations, those who don't have access, to example, to internet and other items that are critically needed compared to more affluent communities. And that is the case also of Hartford in our cities. So when we're talking about budget cuts and slashes, the direct impact of that will have is if our public school budget was already flat funded for the last 10 years, imagine now we're going to probably be seeing less money than before. And so already operating with less, but now it's going to have even broader impacts, because now you're talking about students not being able to get back to school, who knows when, in person, and what impacts does that have on a child's education, not being able to be there in person, but on top of that, not having access to being able to log in virtually, and on top of that, already possibly being having lesser and lesser funds to work with per pupil in terms of the per pupil funding. And so that's an immediate impact that's going to have at the local level, with serious impacts in the longer term consequences in terms of just our communities. So that's a direct way.
Sarah, I want to turn to you quickly. So Sarah is the executive director of Local Progress, my first job out of college, my favorite place. Can you talk just a little bit about what local elected officials across the country are seeing in budget shortfalls?
Thanks, Josie. And it is so great to be here with you and with Tashara and Wildelise, two incredible local progress leaders. Feels very full circle. Let me just start by saying that in the midst of the crisis around us, I found consistent inspiration in what's happening in the local level. So in the earliest days of this crisis, in every corner of the country, in cities large and small, local elected officials sprang into action, displaying the type of leadership we need. As unemployment and food insecurity have risen to unprecedented levels in our lifetime, it's local governments who led the charge to create some of the quickest and first funds to provide needed fiscal assistance to those impacted by COVID-19. And to ensure that financial insecurity does not become housing insecurity, local governments were some of the first to put moratoriums on evictions and utility shutoffs and to launch housing relief funds. So while the federal government has so far prioritized bailing out corporations, in cities and counties across the country, local governments have moved quickly and responded directly to this crisis, demonstrating compassion matched with resourcefulness and creativity. And that is just the type of leadership we need in government at all levels. What are the challenges cities are facing now? As demonstrated by what Tashara and Wildelise shared, local governments are seeing their coffers emptied as they face declining revenues, while also trying to respond urgently and compassionately to a crisis with no end in sight. Faced with few choices, they're being forced to make drastic budget cuts that put essential public services at risk. And of course, these are the very same services that are needed now more than ever to safeguard public health. So Josie, you referenced this in your opening. The National League of Cities and U.S. Conference of Mayors published a survey of 2,463 cities, towns, and villages, which show that nearly every local government, regardless of population size, is expecting revenue shortfalls due to COVID-19. And 88% of local leaders anticipate that this pandemic will lead to painful reductions in revenue this year and beyond. And unlike the federal government, local governments have extremely limited tools to raise additional revenue and cannot run deficits. So they need help or they'll be forced to cut vital services. So the solution here is very clear. Cities and counties and local governments need more direct funding from the federal government. There have been 4 recovery bills to date, and only one of them has provided direct funding to local governments. And the amount of funding in the CARES Act was woefully insufficient. And as several other folks on this call have already pointed out, it excluded direct funding to municipalities with populations less than 500,000. So we're glad to see that the Democratic leadership is listening to state and local leaders. And we think that some of the provisions of the bill announced today is a good first step. Our local governments are demonstrating the creativity and resourcefulness that we need in advocating at the federal level for additional funding, in looking to states to pass progressive revenue measures to ensure that the wealthy are paying their fair share in this crisis. And the bottom line is that we're leading at the local level, but we need bold action across all levels of local government. And this starts with federal funding to localities.
Yeah, so on last week, we talked about federal funding. We talked about the deficit. We had on Stephanie Kelton and other sort of experts on this issue. And I think it's really important to reemphasize what you're saying, right? The federal government's operating in a deficit is very, 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 very different than the state and local governments operating in a deficit. It doesn't function the same way. Any confusion we have about that, I think, needs to be kind of immediately cleared up. And we're literally talking about state and local governments having to file for bankruptcy. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for state and local government that actually has to file for bankruptcy?
Yeah, so I mean, let's be clear, forcing or leaving cities and states to file for bankruptcy is not an option, despite what Mitch McConnell says. And, you know, I just have to say again, this crisis has made so clear the crucial role that local government plays in safeguarding our health and well-being. And if localities are forced to file for bankruptcy, it will be devastating to our communities. So for example, let's look at the city of Detroit, which filed for bankruptcy in 2013 as one example. After the bankruptcy filing, Detroit was forced to gut and basically privatize their public health department and shut off water to tens of thousands of residents. Now imagine hundreds or thousands of local governments across the country having to do that right now. It's never been more clear than it is right now. Public health, housing, food, and water, these are all essential services that we need our governments to step up and provide for us so that we can survive through this crisis and thrive beyond it.
Great. So again, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us and kind of have a quick panel discussion with all of you. The first question is, how did we get here? I mean, that sounds, we could write a couple books on this and do a whole 10-year show on this, but are these shortfalls because of budget mishandling at the state and local level, as Senator McConnell has accused? Is this because of the federal government? How did we get to a point? I mean, obviously the pandemic has exacerbated this, but this is a sign that we haven't had sort of the stability we need on the state and local level in terms of funding, even before that. This could go to any of you, but I'll start with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we're seeing right now is a need to really reject austerity and reject the sorts of measures that have over time left our municipalities, left our school systems underfunded with increased needs for service. And, you know, there's been a significant trend over time of limiting the ability of localities to raise additional revenue through state level prohibitions out of, you know, fear of raising taxes and asking the wealthy and well-off among us and corporations to pay their fair share. So I think what we're seeing now is, you know, a crisis put upon what was already a crisis. I mean, when we would gather local progress members together 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, revenue was always a significant topic, right? And how can local governments that are really working to center equity get the support they need from the state and federal governments, pursue progressive revenue measures that ensure corporations and the wealthy are paying their fair share, and that local services are not decimated. So I think this is just a continuing trend, but then obviously like an axe dropped on what was already a quite vulnerable situation.
And Tashara Jones, what's your, as the treasurer of a local government, what are your thoughts on this?
Before I became a treasurer, I was also, I have a master's in health administration. And one of the things I learned during my master's program was that the United States is one of the only developed countries without universal health insurance or universal health coverage. And we've seen in other countries where there's a universal health system that their outbreak and their response to this pandemic has been swifter and hasn't had the loss of life that we've seen in the United States. You know, I think that how we got here goes all the way back to the founding of this country, and how Native Americans were pushed onto reservations and their land was stolen from them, and how our sort of racist capitalist system this is sort of that, all of that coming to fruition and chickens coming home to roost. So, I mean, we can go back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years to answer the question of how we got here.
So
I agree. Yeah. I just wanted to chime
Yeah,
in, and
please.
it's really, in a nutshell, about prioritization. Where are we prioritizing our funds? We're prioritizing, the country has been prioritizing it on military and corporations for such a long time. And now the veil has been lifted, and we're only seeing amplified what we've been seeing on the ground in our communities for a very long time.
Mhm. So Representative Haaland, this $1 trillion package, and the package that was just released is aimed at addressing current projected pandemic shortfalls. Of course, we don't know what's coming, right? We're not sure what the next few months look like. We are all kind of flying blind in this situation. What more would you say is needed to not just help cities meet the needs of the pandemic, but actually evolve to be able to better cope with situations like this in the future?
Right. So I am so honored to be on this panel with such amazing women who are doing everything. They know what's happening, right? We all just need to get on board and move our country forward. I want to respond a little bit to the question of how did we get here?
Yes, please.
And I want to remind everyone, not that we could ever forget this, how the president downplayed this virus and called it a Democratic hoax and didn't take it seriously. And it is so much worse. We have the highest rate of infections of any country in the entire world. And that's because we don't have the leadership we need. Our president did not take this seriously. We are in this position because of him. But breaking that all up and apart, the Republicans gave the biggest tax break in history to their friends, to the richest people who don't need a tax break. Our workers, our working families, this pandemic has laid bare the disparity in our societies for the people who, people who can't afford, they need the breaks, and yet the Republicans insisted on giving tax breaks to the richest people in our country. So now we're left to pick up the pieces. And one of the things I just wanted to highlight real quick is our Essential Worker Bill of Rights. We're working hard to make sure that essential workers are protected with PPE, with hazard pay, with childcare benefits. These are grocery store workers, trash collectors, postal workers, of course, our frontline medical workers. These are the folks who are suffering the most, and they are keeping our country moving while, we're trying to pick up the pieces of a failed presidency. So moving forward, I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of what your original question was, but these we need to take care of these folks so they can keep our country moving until we can find a place where we know it's safe to resume. But decades and decades of disparities in Indian country. Thank you, Treasurer, for mentioning Indian tribes. That's the honest to God truth. People haven't been paid fairly at some point in our country. The Republicans decided that we shouldn't value the work that people do in this country. And I think that's a shame. And now we're seeing the results of that because this pandemic has laid bare those disparities in our country. So we need to think about right now, who do we value? Who do we value in our country? The people who grow and harvest our food, the people who collect our trash, yes, like has been mentioned before, and absolutely the people who are taking care of our loved ones who are in the hospital and in our elderly care centers. And so yes, this is like a reawakening for many people, and we need to do so much better.
Thank you. No, that totally answered the question. That was that's exactly what we've been trying to talk about on the show. How are we sort of rethinking the future, and rebuilding a structure and in a government that serves the people. Before we go, I want to make sure that anybody else who might have thoughts and input about what more is needed to not just help cities meet the needs of this pandemic, but actually evolve to better cope with situations like this, gets to speak up. So does anybody else have thoughts? I'm like putting off.
I wanted
hanging
to,
up.
I,
Oh, yes,
I
please.
wanted to just mention, along with frontline workers, are childcare providers who are essential workers and who have been underpaid for such a long time. And the list goes on, right? That's just one example.
Mhm.
But really, our working class families, our working class individuals have been working without getting the adequate pay that they deserve. And now is time to also fight for that and to amplify that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us on the briefing. This is my first all-female briefing panel, and I love it. This is wonderful. This has just been so great and so informative, and I can't tell you enough how grateful we are for the hard work that all of you are doing every day to make sure that people are getting through this pandemic, that we are going to survive and come out on the other side. So it does not go unnoticed, and we're very grateful. Thank you so much for joining us on the briefing.